We are especially delighted to host Bruce Feiler, who's a Yale College alumnus. He is, of course, also a 6-time consecutive New York Times best-selling author, a popular TED speaker, and has many, many, many accolades. Some of you may already be familiar with his accomplishments, and I'm not going to repeat them, but I just kind of want to share about how I first came about this book. This year has been kind of life-changing for a lot of people due to the pandemic. I was stuck in a remote part of the US for months trying to figure out how my family, my husband, my 3 children, and I would be able to move back to China. And it was during this time when I heard a podcast where Bruce was at an interview about this book, and it totally disrupted my life and inspired me to share the message and share his book with more people. So today I'm delighted to be co-hosting this with the Yale Club of Hong Kong, Singapore, India, the Yale SOM Hong Kong chapter, and the like. And I'm just so happy that we have so many people joining from this area of the world to hear more about your book, Bruce, which is relevant everywhere. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm in Brooklyn, so it's the crack of dawn. I got to see my kids off to school this morning, which was a rare treat before joining all of you.
Thank you, Bruce. Well, I'll start with doing the questions, and after a while, we'll open this up to Q&A with all the audience who are joining us from all over the world. So first of all, when you were doing the research and writing for this book, there was no COVID-19, obviously. And so, but in this day and age, it has become a very timely book, whether for many people I've read about and for me, myself personally. So I wanna ask you, when you first set out to write this book prior to the pandemic, what sort of an impact were you hoping to make?
Well, let me work my way to that question and first tell a little bit about my backstory and how I came up with this idea. And there's actually a Yale in China and Yale in Asia part of this story, which I never get to tell. So that will be fun for me. So I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, 5 generations in the American South, and I went to Yale I was a freshman in 1983 in Ezra Stiles College. And in the second half of my junior year, I went to Japan. And that began what became many years of my life living in East Asia. So I graduated in 1987 and went and took a job teaching junior high school in a rural part of Japan, about 50 miles and 50 years north of Tokyo. And I spent a year doing that. And and then I went and spent a year as a reporter in Tokyo. And then I was scheduled to meet my Yale College girlfriend and take the Trans-Siberian Express from Beijing to Moscow. Now, of course, this would have been 1989. This is before the Berlin Wall fell. In fact, the train was scheduled to leave on June 8th.
What?
Exactly, June 8th, 1989. So obviously, I don't have to tell you that that train never took off, or if it took off, it did not take off with me. In fact, so I was in Tokyo. My then girlfriend Karen had just ended 2 years doing Yale in China. In fact, she was in Tiananmen Square on the morning when they distributed leaflets to say, today we're going to come into the square. And so she flew to Hong Kong, and I flew to Hong Kong, and we all gathered. Yale in China, it may still, I don't know if anyone's here from Hong Kong. At the time, there was an apartment where all the Yale China people in Hong Kong used to live. And so about 20 people converged in this apartment that had kind of 4 single rooms and watched the events unfold live on television. And what I kind of most distinctly remember about that. So basically all the Yale Chinese people had flooded to Hong Kong, to this kind of safe house, if you will, because no one knew what was going to happen. And it was the weekend that Michael Chang won the French Open tennis tournament. And I've always felt like if I ever write a novel, I want it to be about, because there was lots of drama that was taking place, and it was just like you felt like you were living in history. Anyway, so that's my sort of Yale in China story. So I feel connected to the whole Yale community, and I've spent lots of time. And in fact, I think there's some people here from Singapore. Perhaps I thought you were going to mention this, but my wife now serves, who actually went to Harvard undergraduate and Yale Law School, now serves on the, PCIA, the President's Commission on International Affairs. And we were in Hong Kong, we were in Singapore last summer, and we went to the Yale NUS campus and took a tour of that wonderful facility. So, that was my life. And when I moved to Japan at that time, I started writing letters home, and I'm older. I'm looking like many of the people on this call, but that was on crinkly airmail paper that I wrote those letters home. And when I got back to Georgia 6 months later, everyone said, "I loved your letters." And I was like, "Great, have we met?" And it turned out my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, and they went viral in a sort of old-fashioned sense of the word. And I thought, well, I should write a book about this. I never knew anyone who wrote a book, and it doesn't happen this way, but I sold my first book at 24, and I wrote this book called Learning to Bow about teaching junior high school in Japan. And so that propelled me into this life. And in my 20s, I wrote books about Japan, about England. I spent a year as a circus clown. I then, in my 30s, traveled back and forth to the Middle East and wrote, you can see some pictures of me in various desert settings behind my back, wrote a series of books about one called Walking the Bible, and a book about Abraham and interfaith relations. And I made some television series. I got married, I had children. And one of the reasons I want to tell that whole story is I think of that as now what I think of as a kind of a linear life. I figured out what I wanted to do early. I did it for no money. Then I had some success, and I got married, I had children. That's a sort of linear trajectory that many of us were raised to believe is sort of the fantasy of how we live. But then in my 40s, I just got walloped by life. First, I got cancer at 43 as a new dad of identical daughters. Then I almost went bankrupt in the recession in the US in 2008 and 9. And then my dad, who has Parkinson's, tried to take his own life. 6 times in 12 weeks, he tried to kill himself. And in the middle of this, like, we didn't know what to do, but I started sending my dad, because I'm a story person and a meaning person, I started sending my dad questions about his life. Tell me about the toys you played with, the house you grew up in, how'd you become an Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts, how did you join the Navy? And my dad couldn't move his fingers, but he would write these letters and then write these kind of stories. And this went on for 5 years. And it was a very powerful experience. And I learned a lot about how in times of change, we have to think and adapt to the life story that we tell ourselves. And I learned a lot about storytelling kind of being central to our psychology and who we are and how we think about our lives. And I thought I would write about this because that's what I do in my life, but I got stuck. And then there's another Yale story, which I will indulge one more quick story before I kind of get to answering your question. So I went to my 30th Yale reunion, and we were in Branford College, and I was moderating a panel of prominent classmates. And on my way driving there, my friend, I thought I would catch up with, and he was closing a like a $28 million real estate deal with Chinese money. But he was also crying because his business partner had a 9-month-old baby, and the 9-month-old baby went down for a chat and never woke up. And so I got to New Haven. We were in a room, I can't remember which room, with like 250 people. I had these prominent classmates. I had their resumes, right? And they were all very impressive. And I literally ripped them up. And I said, you know what? Losers don't come to their college reunion. I don't want to hear about your success. Tell your mother. I want to hear about your struggles. And that night, we were under one of these tents, and it took me 2 hours to walk from one side of the room to the other because person after person came up and told a story. My wife had a headache and went to the hospital and died. My boss stole money from me. My brother was just diagnosed with cancer. My daughter has an anxiety disorder. And what everybody was saying was the life I'm living is not the life I expected to be living. Like I'm living life out of order, right? That linear life didn't happen to me. My life has a lot of ups and downs. It's exactly what you just said at the beginning in your beautiful intro. And I called my wife and I said, no one knows how to tell their life story anymore, and I have to figure out how to help. And so what I did was I set out on this journey collecting what became hundreds of life stories of Americans in all 50 states, people who lost homes, lost limbs, changed careers, changed religions, got sober, got out of bad marriages. And the question I was attempting to answer, which is your original question, was what happens when the fairy tale doesn't come true? Like what happens when the story that we expect to be telling and we were raised to believe was truth gets disrupted in some way? And I wasn't, as you kind of have to hold up my book, like I didn't know I was looking for life transitions. I didn't know I was looking for nonlinearity. All of the ideas that emerged in this process, I was just basically looking for a question of how do people overcome these unexpected events in their lives?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Where do you think this expectation of a linear life came from? And how does knowing that life isn't that way change the way you view life and transitions?
So this is an interesting question. I think it's a particularly interesting question with this audience, and I'd be interested to hear how people talk about this, because essentially what happened to me was that one day I pulled, you can see all the books in my office here, I think in this screen. One day I sort of pulled the book off of my shelf and it felt like the entire shelf opened and I was in another room, that fantasy like out of a children's book. I later learned that Dan Brown actually has one of those shelves in his castle in France. And what I discovered was that sort of every culture has a kind of paradigmatic life shape that people expect. And so if we'll talk about kind of Western civilization for a second, sort of in the ancient world, in the Mediterranean, there was no linear times, right? So they believed that life followed a circle, right? Following an agricultural calendar, right? So to every season, turn is a line in the Hebrew Bible. And then when the time, Christianity in the biblical and the sort of the Bible introduces in the West this idea of linear time. If you think about what the Bible does, right, it's sort of time is embedded in these characters and in these stories. So that became the dominant kind of view of life in the West. So if in the Middle Ages, you can begin to see in Europe, you can begin to see illustrations of the kind of classic life, which is a staircase up to middle age and a staircase down. Now, what does that mean? And by the way, this is the same for men and women, even though the stages were different. And what that means, even the idea of a life stage kind of arises in the Middle Ages because theater becomes very popular, right? So stages, phases, these all ideas were invented. In fact, the word career, it actually comes from a kind of a horse and carriage that used to race in a circular track. So these are constructs that are invented, even though we don't think about that, and it's not how we talk about our lives. So basically, with the birth of science in the late 19th century, you begin to have this kind of linear construct that gets created. So if you think about the first 100 years of psychology, you have Piaget, the Swiss child psychologist, saying children develop in a linear progress. You have Freud saying there are these psychosexual stages of development. You have Erikson saying the 8 stages of moral development. You have the 5 stages of grief. You have the hero's journey. These are all linear constructs of life. And this reaches its peak in the West with a woman named Gail Sheehy, who in the 1970s writes a book called Passages. That's a huge book that 20 million people read. And it's actually based on research from a Yale psychologist whose name is Daniel Levinson, who interviews 40 people, only men, in New Haven, sorry, Devin, but in New Haven, and concludes that men's lives follow a sequential set of stages. And she writes this book, Sheehy, called Passages, that says that everyone does the same thing in their 20s, then in their 30s, and then everyone has a midlife crisis at 39 and a half. And it's so prescriptive. It says this midlife crisis must start by 39 and a half and must end by 45. The problem is this is all bunk. It's completely artificial, and it does not reflect how we live our lives. So you cut to where we are today. Now, again, in East Asia, this is an interesting story because the influence of Buddhism has a kind of circular a kind of legacy of, and so you have the sort of the hierarchy of the whole Confucian idea juxtaposed against this idea of, I'd be interested if anybody wants to comment about that later. But so we're talking about, the West here primarily, but now, so go back to sort of the core thing I said, like how we look at the world affects how we look at our lives. So how we look at our lives now, the world now, we understand that there's chaos theory, that there's complexity, that there's nonlinearity, that there's periods of stability and periods of instability, periods of periodicity, as they call it, and non-periodicity. But we haven't updated the way we look at our lives. So sort of the big idea that emerges from these 1,000 hours of interviews that I did was that the linear life is dead. It's not really reflective of how we live. And it's been replaced by what I call the non-linear life. Like my data show that we have one disruptor, as I call it. We have 36 in our lives. That's one every 12 to 18 months. That's more often than many people see a dentist. And most of those, that can be small, like an accident or breaking your leg, or a roof hits the, whatever, a branch hits the ceiling, or huge, like getting fired from your job, or getting a cancer diagnosis, or a pandemic. And most of these we get through, but 1 in 10 of them, the pandemic being a good example, becomes a huge, massive change that I call a lifequake. And so a lifequake is kind of higher on the Richter scale of consequences and has aftershocks that last for years. And the kind of the signature piece of data in this story is that the life transition that comes out of that often takes 4 or 5 years. That's the most common answer, and it's the average answer. And so if you think we have 3 to 5 of these in a lifetime and they take 4, 5, 6 years, that's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives we spend in this state of transition. And so kind of the consuming passion of mine became, okay, as long as we're going to spend half our lives in this unsettled state, what are the tools, what's the structure to these times that can allow us to navigate them more effectively?
Mm-hmm. Tell us more about the tools, because when I think about before I listened to your podcast and read your book, and I think many people on the call would share the same perspective with me, which is that although changes, disruptions, life quakes are so prevalent in life, I'm dead scared of them.
Yes.
If things are going well. If things are going well, I don't want life to change. Of course, if things aren't going well, I want it to change for the better. But what is it that makes it so scary? And what are the tools that you have found that have helped people master these changes throughout their lives?
So I just want to acknowledge that it is scary. In fact, I looked at 225 people in the eye and said, what's the biggest emotion that you struggled with in this time of change? The number one most common answer was fear. Mm-hmm. Okay. How am I going to live without money? Like, how am I going to live without this loved one? What am I going to do if I have to now work from home and educate my children? How am I going to deal with the difficulty of a diagnosis? Am I going to be alive at all? Number one was fear. Number two was sadness. I liked my own life. I liked my old job. I liked having that loved one in the bed next to me. I liked being able to talk to my mother before she died. The third answer is interesting. Again, you have an interesting cultural dynamic here, but the third most common answer was shame, which surprised me, by the way. And it was, and I here, kind of in the literature in the West, we often think of shame as a gendered emotion, that women feel shame more than men, but that was not my experience in my conversation. So I'm ashamed I don't have my job. I'm ashamed I have to ask for help. I'm ashamed that what I did to my children when I was drinking too much. I'm ashamed that I have a child who has an emotional disorder of some kind. So shame. And we can talk about later about how people navigate that. But let me go back a little bit and go and work my way toward this and say that the life quakes that we experience, 53% of them are involuntary. So an involuntary life quake is your spouse cheats on you, you lose your job, you have a natural disaster. But 47% are voluntary, like we make changes in our lives that are disruptive. So for example, you leave a job to start a new venture. Maybe you get in a cross-cultural marriage and move across the world. Maybe you cheat on your spouse. This is interesting because I was born in 1964, which means technically I'm part of the baby boom. And I looked at these numbers and I thought, wow, 47% of our life quakes are voluntary. Like we are embracing the nonlinear life. We are accepting that change can happen. Obviously, almost everybody in this call had the cross-cultural experience of either growing up, in Asia and coming to North America to go to school, or, growing up someplace else and then repatriating or moving because of a relationship or a job back to East Asia. So for many people here, these were probably voluntary changes, but they're still enormous, right? I had identical twin daughters. Trust me, that was a life quake. I mean, it was a blessed one, but it changed our sleep schedule, our work schedule, our financial life. Everything changes, even with these voluntary things. So, but here's the point that I want to make. The life quake can be voluntary or involuntary, but the life transition that comes out of it must be voluntary. You have to choose to lean in and go through the changes to get through to the other side, okay? And so this turns out to be the powerful thing. Like when people go through this kind of life quake that we've all been through in the pandemic, and the pandemic is a perfect example. The pandemic and the kind of the construct of my book is a collective involuntary life quake. So a collective involuntary life quake is a war, right? A recession, a natural disaster we're going through with other people. And by the way, that was the smallest category in my book. And now lo and behold, my book arrives at this moment when we're all going through it. But that's deceptive, right? Because I'm just looking at people's names here. The transition that that Joan may go through is different from what Joyce may go through, is different from what Liu may go through, and that's important. We have to kind of pick the transition that we're going to make. So you pick it. Now what? Well, people tend to react in one of two ways. Either, and this may be the experience of a lot of people here, either you make a 222 item to-do list and you say, I'm going to get through the entire thing this weekend and I'm going to be the greatest transitioner in the history of transitions. Or we get through what sounds like you went through at the start of this, which is I'm stuck. I have no idea what to do. I'm lying in a fetal position on my bed and I just think that I'm totally inert. But it turns out when you look at enough of these that they have a kind of structure. So kind of lesson number one is that transitions are divided into 3 phases. Okay, I call these phases the long goodbye, where you mourn the life that's not coming back. Then there is what I call the messy middle. And in the messy middle, you shed certain habits and you create new habits. And then there's the new beginning, when you unveil your new self. And so if you think about the pandemic being an example, at the beginning, I think that collectively the planet had a crisis of long goodbye. Because what happened when the pandemic first hit is I think we all felt we would stay inside, we would mitigate, and then life would be back to normal. And certainly in many cases, our leaders told us that. But we're 7 months into it now, and guess what? We are not going back. And I think that everybody now accepts the fact that even when we get through this, the life is going to be different. Was that a cat that just walked over over a screen there? So the long goodbye is an incredibly important part where you sort of have to accept that this is an emotional experience. So you asked for a tool, so we'll start with the long goodbye. So the first tool of the 7 tools that kind of emerged in this analytic process I did with a team of 12 people for a year is that it's an emotional experience. So you have to identify the emotion that you're struggling with. I just said the top 3 were fear, sadness, and shame. And then how do people deal? That's sort of the second tool is it's fascinating, right? So some people write their feelings down, and that's very powerful. If you're going through a difficult time, just taking 3 days, writing about it for 15 minutes a day there's a whole body of research that this can be very effective. Some people do what I like to do, which is sort of shut up and go back to work, like stop complaining, right? So that's kind of, so the first one's write it down, and this one is like buckle down. Like I'm very much of a buckle downer. But 80%, this was fascinating to me, 80% of people use rituals of some way. You know, they hold a farewell ceremony. They bury something in the backyard. They take a memento and put it on their desk as a reminder of what they're going through. They hold ceremonies. They sing songs. They go to sweat lodges. They go on walkabouts. I talked to a woman in Los Angeles who had a very difficult year. She was a bone marrow donor to her brother. She had a big falling out with her mother. She went on 52 first dates and only 7 second dates. And she's like, this is not working. Her biggest fear was heights. Her ritual was she jumped out of an airplane. These are sort of gestures that we do to ourselves and to others to say, I'm going through a difficult time, acknowledging it, saying out loud, and then I'm ready for sort of the next stages that are to come.
Wow. Can you tell me more about how you found these 225 stories, and how did you come up with the methodology and get this team of 12 to analyze it, slice and dice it for a year?
So I started with people that I knew. In fact, I started with all the people from my Yale class who had told me their harrowing stories. And then I sort of asked them and everybody, like, to me, I just can't believe I have all these people on a call. Like, I want to ask each of you, because in fact, I'm about to do it again with people who had interesting work stories. So I sort of feel like I would have, like, if I'd run into you or any of these people, I would have said, who do you know who's had an interesting life story? And then about 2 months into this, I mean, it was actually an interesting process, because I initially said I should do only people 40 and above, because they've sort of been beaten up by life. And it was my wife, Linda, I mentioned earlier, she runs an organization that supports entrepreneurs around the world. She's like, no, I have a lot of millennials work for me, and their lives are just as, nonlinear. So I don't often say this, but she was right. And so I did the whole kind of age 20 to age 90. And about 2 months into this, she walks into my room, my office here in Brooklyn one night, and I say, guess what? Like, I think I can get 25 states of course, the 50 states in the United States. And she basically looked at me and she said, and this will tell you a lot about my marriage. She said, get 50 or shut up. And she turned and walked out of the room. So sort of at that point that I was a couple of months into it, I realized I needed to be more systematic and kind of academic about it. So I then sort of set out to do all 50 states. It was very hard to get Delaware, but actually Yale graduate Chris Coons, who is now a senator from Delaware and a close ally of Joe Biden. And in the event that Joe Biden wins, there's some speculation he'll be Secretary of State. He raised his hand, for Facebook friends, and he said he would do it. So I got Delaware. That was my 50th. But then I set out to make sure that I had kind of demographic. So I realized at this point that I was going to have this incredible trove, and I set out to make sure it was demographically representative. And in fact, I said that I'm doing this again. I'll talk about this later, perhaps, talking about people, their life stories. I literally spent the last 24 hours making what I call my bingo card of all the jobs people have in the United States from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to make sure that I have represent. And the methodology grew out. There's a very interesting, I'll just, because it's a Yale audience here, I'm going to geek out on the science a bit. There was a guy named Dan McAdams in the 1980s who was a Harvard PhD. And actually, Peter Salovey also did I mean, if I go over to my shelf, there's a Peter Salovey book. Of course, he's the president of Yale now. There was a kind of a movement in academic psychology to look at narrative as a kind of a construct of identity, and to realize that the story, like if I, went around this gathering here and I said, tell me stop for a second and listen to the story that you have in your head. It's a story about who you are, where you came from, where you were born, what's important to you. If you got a call right now that said, rush to the hospital, you have a loved one in the hospital, you would begin to construct a story about how you know that person and what they've meant to you, right? That story that's kind of always running in the back of our heads, that story is not part of who we are. That story is who we are in a fundamental way. Like life is the story that you tell yourself. And this is an idea that went from the fringes of academic psychology in the 1980s to the very heart of academic psychology today. And in fact, a whole generation of neuroscience has shown us that our minds are wired to process information in stories, right? If I'm telling you a story right now, what your mind is doing is actually completing that story for you. So every time I begin to say something, you anticipate what I'm going to say, and you kind of assume that you know what I'm going to say, which is why, oh my God, a pumpkin just came through the window. When I mention that pumpkin, like you perk up. By the way, anybody making a work presentation needs to understand this fundamentally. Like if you are telling a story, presenting information in a professional context, or even talking to your children, if every sentence ends the way people expect, then your people, oh my God, a car just came through the window. Like you perk up when I say a car just came through the window. So you have to surprise people, keep them interested, and that will engage them. And I'm almost prepared to say, like, if I talked to you a year from now and I ran into each of you and I said, you would probably mention the pumpkin coming through the window, right? So the irony is that the pandemic is the pumpkin through the window. Right? So the pandemic is the unexpected thing. So we think of our lives as a fairy tale, right? That we're the hero and there's a happy ending. But the truth is that what makes it the fairy tale is the wolf. So there's a wolf or an ogre or a dragon that shows up in the middle. And that sort of turned out to be what emerged from this process is life is about handling the wolf or the ogre or the tornado or the downsizing or the pandemic. And like if you guys, I mean, you're at the end of your day. Tomorrow you're going to wake up and let's just say you go off into your day and you come back and you connect with someone at the end of your day, a loved one, a friend, and you say, what did you do today? You're not going to say, oh, guess what? The subway worked on time. Guess what? I got through, I got everything I wanted at the supermarket. You're going to say the subway was late or they didn't have pumpkins. And so life is about using storytelling to heal the breaches in our story. And so basically these academics created a template for asking people about their stories, which I consulted them and basically modified for my own purposes.
That's great. Can you tell us more about, I mean, speaking of a pumpkin coming through the window, what was something that was surprising or unexpected about this process of writing this book or this book coming out during such a momentous time in history?
Yeah, well, those are different questions. I mean, just another idea because so drop in another tool here. So I said that there are 3 phases,
right?
And a lot of these tools correspond to the phases. So the long goodbye is about accepting your emotions and using rituals, and then that leads to the messy middle, and the messy middle involves shedding certain habits. So either habits that you liked, like, oh my gosh, I liked having money and now I have less money, or I liked living near my parents and now I live on the other side of the world, which everybody here has had that experience, including me. But what happens is the shedding creates room for creativity. And this turns out to be one of the things that surprised me, which is people using astonishing acts of creativity to reinvent themselves in the middle of a difficult time, okay? So people paint, they write poetry, they learned, I mean, I talked to a woman who was raised in an East Asian American family. She was Korean American, and she had a very diligent life, and she became a chemistry professor in Alabama. And in her 60s, she got cancer. I think it was gastric cancer. Her husband didn't want to take care of her, so she left him. She ultimately retired from teaching university chemistry. And she said, I always wanted to be a ballerina. My mother wouldn't let me. So she starts adult ballet in her 60s, right? And I heard I talked to a guy named Zach Herrick, who was born Black in Kansas and raised by a white family, adopted family. He joined the military and he ended up in Afghanistan and had his face shot off by the Taliban. 31 surgeries between the tip of his nose and the tip of his chin, including having his tongue sewn back on. And he was on the verge of suicide multiple times. And then his mother suggested that he learn to cook because his tastes had changed. And then he starts to write poetry, and then he starts to paint, and he describes splattering paint on the canvas. And he said, you know, like Jackson Pollock, the 1950s abstract expressionist painter in New York. He said, yeah, like him. And I said, well, wait a minute. If I told your high school football playing self that you were painting and writing poetry and cooking, he's like, I would have thought it was stupid, but I used to get out my aggression by splattering bullets with the enemy, and now I do it by splattering paint on a canvas. And I think the point is that creativity, people do it naturally. They don't say, I mean, the best example is the pandemic. Like, I mean, certainly in this country, I don't know what it was in the social media feeds that all of you have, but here, the number one cliche about the pandemic was that people started baking, right? And, you know, in the United States, we ran out of yeast. Yeah. And people were doing sourdough because you didn't need the yeast, right? So I may have been the only person who wasn't surprised by this, because just that act of getting your hands in there and, like, you know, creating a piece of bread and then eating it and enjoying it, just a little act of creativity like that. If I can remake this meal, if I can remake this day, then I can remake my life. That I found very, very surprising. And the last question you said about how, you know, in terms of, you know, before we open up to questions here, but you asked how the biggest surprise was that I worked on this book for half a decade, and then it arrives in the middle of this moment when the entire planet is going through a transition at the same time. So that turned out, I was saying before you all joined, that a friend of mine said, if you're going to worship a God, it should be the God of timing. So it turned out that people have a kind of emotional, visceral need for this. Yeah. So this book got a ton of attention. It was a top 10 New York Times bestseller. So it turned out to be kind of the right book for the right moment, and exactly the way you were kind enough to share about your own vulnerability and confusion about you're separated from where you want to be living. You have your children, what's going to happen. So many people have felt that because the entire planet is going through one of these life quakes at the same time.
Thank you. And to answer your question about what's popular in Chinese social media or during the pandemic, cooking and baking were definitely.
Cooking, there you go. There you go. Couldn't be, again, I'm not surprised. It's not my feed, but I'm not surprised because it's, you know, and then the other thing it is that represents, it's sort of like helping other people through it, right? So it's sort of, you know, don't go it alone. Sharing it is part of this process. And so I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised.
Well, it really goes to show how transitions, life quakes are really part of life anywhere in the world. Yeah. I mean, you know, given your very interesting experience of having been in Japan, I'd be curious to know, just based on, you know, any cultural nuances that you perceive, you know, this is just very cliched, but I have to say, you know, let's say in a culture where people are less willing to share stories or share personal lives and kind of more reserved in a certain way because of language and culture, yeah, or history or whatever it is. How would you think a life story project would happen, or what would encourage people in that kind of a culture to share stories?
That's such a fantastic question, actually, because it actually brings up, so just to take a step back. So I got interested in life stories actually about 10 years ago when I was working on a book. I wrote a column in the New York Times for a decade on contemporary families. And a lot of that work went into a book that I wrote called The Secrets of Happy Families, when I went out and talked to people about how they navigate mornings and discipline and difficult conversations. And there's some real life happening outside my window in Brooklyn, if you can hear that. Yeah. Although that fire truck doesn't seem to be going by. I hope my house is not on fire. It's very windy and raining here this morning, and everybody's, as you know, very tense about the election on Tuesday. The most interesting idea that emerged from that research was about the power of storytelling in children. Okay, so two researchers at Emory did this research in which they asked children how much about their family history that they knew. Do you know where your grandparents were born? Do you know an aunt or uncle who had a difficult time? Do you know what was happening, how your parents met and what was happening around your birth? And the children who knew more about family history, it was the #1 predictor of a child's emotional well-being, the #1 predictor. And what the researchers at Emory in Atlanta told me is that there are kind of these constructs that families have. There's a sort of ascending family narrative. I came from nothing, I worked hard, I have a lot. There's a descending narrative. I had a lot. There was a war, a recession, we lost it all. And then there is this oscillating narrative of ups and downs. And the children who understand that have a greater confidence that they can handle disruptions that occur in their own lives. And so as a result of this, I got very interested in how people talk. And there's actually research that about family dinner and how people talk. Nothing has been more analyzed than family dinner. And there's research about how East Asian parents talk to their children at dinner and Western parents talk to their children at dinner. And what they found is that the East Asian parents are talking more about duty and obligation and structure. And the Western parents are using more what are called in the academic world elaborative questions. And these elaborative questions are what we in journalism used to call who, what, when, where, how, and why. And so they looked at children. There was a scholar at Boston University, an East Asian scholar who did this research, and she went to families at 2 when the children were 2, and then when the children at 6, and the children who had grown up in dinner table conversations, which were more about order and structure and discipline, when they were 6, they actually were less equipped to tell their own life story, because that story has a kind of a construct that was very hard for them to break out of. Whereas the children who were able more to think of life as a story, who, what, when, where, how, and why. This is what journalists are told, like to try to tell the story, we're better able to kind of tell a simple story about what they did during the day. So again, what this reflects, if you then kind of marry these two ideas, is I think that, again, you're asking me for subtleties. If I were to, I'm entering the world of speculation here. I only gathered American stories because I felt that there were a lot of Asian Americans in my kind of collection of stories. I didn't talk to people in Japan or China or Singapore or any of those places, and certainly not in India and other places like that. But what I would say is the kind of the question that I would ask, based on my knowledge of this part of the world where I spend a lot of time, is what is that construct? And that linear construct is incredibly powerful. But that linear construct, one of the problems, I mentioned this earlier with Dan Levinson at Yale, is it's predominantly a male story, right? Even the idea of a midlife crisis, that phrase was invented by a Canadian anthropologist named Elliot Jacques. And he didn't study people. He just read 300 biographies of famous men. And he said, I didn't include women because menopause throws off the whole narrative for women. Well, that's absurd. If you're not talking to women because their story doesn't fit this construct, then go talk to women, darn it, and realize that people have a different narrative. That's kind of the whole point. If I'm only going to find people that reflect my life. And so I think that I think that everybody in this conversation, if you have a foot in East Asia and a foot in the West, has both narratives clanging around in your head, and that creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that's incredibly challenging, because almost by definition you broke out of the narrative. Although in many cases your families may have wanted you to do that, and so that's what's going on. That is a very powerful thing that we don't spend anywhere near enough time talking about.
Amazing. And given the time constraints, I'm going to start inviting people to ask you questions, because I'm sure many of them are burning with them. So I'm going to let my very capable colleague, Devin Lau, our program director, start to curate questions.
Devin and I are on team early morning.
Yeah, moderate this.
That's right.
Over there. And
right.
For those of you who would like to ask questions, please follow Devin's instructions.
All right, so I guess good evening to most of you. Again, I think we've all done Zoom for a while now, but just in case, There are two options for you to ask questions. One is to use the chat box and just directly type in your questions into the chat box. So Bruce and I can both see those. The other option is under participants. There's the option to raise your hand. So you can go ahead and raise your hand as well, and we would be able to call on you. And we have a relatively small group. So the nice thing about that and being able to do things on Zoom is you do get the chance to interact directly with the author here, Bruce. So yeah, anybody with questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box or raise your hands.
Or I can see all of your names and we're going to call on you.
That's right.
Call you by name if you don't do it.
Right. Yeah. So usually I, have to help moderate, but it seems like Bruce, you know what you're doing here and have probably done a couple of these already. Yeah. So feel free. I know it takes a while for people to like get warmed up here.
Devin, you want to ask a question while we're waiting for a question?
Yeah, I have so many questions. This was a fantastic book. I guess one of the questions in terms of methodology more and sort of how did you come about? I mean, 225 stories, right? At a minimum, I'm sure there are even more that you kind of filtered out. Like just practically, how did you, because I feel like a lot of people have similar ideas of, oh, I noticed this interesting trend of like the people I talk to have this or that happening in their lives. But like, how do you get yourself to actually sit down and actually do the research, do the analysis, do the writing? So I guess this is more of a question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say about that, this is the 15th book that I've done. So I've lived my whole life and I believe in kind of immersion. I was interested in sort of understanding the connection between the Bible and ancient history. And so I spent a year traipsing, climbing Mount Ararat and crossing the Red Sea and tasting manna. Obviously I lived in Japan. I spent a year in the circus. So I believe in immersion. I think of myself as a not interesting person, but I've done a lot of interesting things. So once I realized that the question here was about life stories, I had to collect these life stories. And I think that methodologically, that's the first thing, was to realize I didn't go and talk to people about their life transitions. I did the first question was, tell me about the story of your life in 15 minutes. Most people took an hour, and then I would do high point, low point, turning point, a transition you handled well, a transition you handled poorly. Obviously, all this is in the book, which you've seen, and so now I've been talking to you for an hour and a half. I now at this point know a lot about your life. And I say, let's pick one transition and let's dig into it. And then I would go through literally the micro steps, like, was this voluntary or involuntary? Like, what was the biggest emotion that you struggled with? Which phase was the hardest? And then I would be doing this for, I don't know, I'd do a couple dozen and I realized I had a lot of baking and painting and dancing. Okay, so then I would add a question. Wait a minute, I've been talking to a lot of people, Joan, and they tell me that they do creativity. Are you doing creativity? Or I'd be talking to people and they talked about like how they structured their time. And so I kept adding new questions based on what was happening. And there was a little bit of, I was so frustrated at this point, having read the history of this kind of a field, by how small the population groups were. As I said, Dan Levinson did 40 only men. And he comes up with the phrase, he popularizes the idea of midlife crisis. That's the foundation. That just annoyed me, okay? Even Gail Sheehy did 100 people. So I was just determined to blow past anybody else. Then it became a little bit competitive. And then also I'd be at like 150 and I was still learning things. So I kept thinking, as soon as I am not learning, I'll stop doing them. And then at every conversation, I would say, who do you know has had an interesting life story? And I got all these names. So it just felt the need to keep going. And until I felt like the patterns were very familiar to me and I was slower on the growth curve, and then I stopped. And then I kind of got a bunch of interns. And in fact, there's a part of me that kind of have said for a while, I wanted to take this life story project and like take it to Yale and like work in some capacity to get myself a bunch of interns. In fact, I'm about to do it again. And I sort of would like to do that because I only analyze these stories, or we only analyze these stories with the questions. You could take the same 6,000 pages of transcripts and ask an entirely different set of questions, and it would be this incredible data set. So I sort of feel like there's an opportunity here for other people to look at the same things with a different set of eyes. Okay, are we getting questions here? Is something popping up in the chat?
Yeah, we've got some questions here. So Mingyue, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question directly. I see you've also typed it, but it must be nice to be able to talk a little bit here.
Where are you on? Are you on page 1 or page 2?
Oh, okay. Thanks so much, Professor Bruce. I have a question that I also attend a seminar arranged by Yale Beijing Center for Robert Miller of his narrative economics, and I just want to ask, is his work has any influence on your work or your work on his? Because you both emphasize the question.
The Robert Shiller narrative economics, right? So he was, I believe he was at that reunion that I was at. The answer is I have read his work. So what she's talking about, for those of you who don't know, is that Robert Shiller, who is the Yale economist who is perhaps best known for the idea of irrational exuberance, has written, there was a paper, I believe that there was a paper and then there was a book. Actually, this was also in the kind of the Yale email about a year or so ago, I believe. So the idea is about narrative economics. And so to take a step back, actually, so I've read that work and I would say it's part of a larger body of work that influenced my work, okay? So just to take a step back, so it was in the 1980s that the idea of narrative psychology kind of first entered. And I was mentioning this guy, Dan McAdams, who was a Harvard PhD. Peter Salovey did this with a professor now at Connecticut. In fact, I talked to Peter Salovey at that reunion, and he was saying, you should go talk to my former colleague. Salovey moved on to other areas. But when Salovey was a graduate student at Yale, this was a popular thing. But what happened was it sort of moved from academic psychology into more mainstream psychology. And then it began to, as ideas do when they catch on, to splinter off into more niche areas. So there became a field called narrative gerontology, which was the idea of older people using storytelling to make sense. There's a popular idea that original research into family stories was done by a guy named Marshall Duke at Emory and his colleague, Robin Fivish. Robin is the pioneer in what's called narrative adolescence. The idea that in adolescence is the first time that children begin to write a story. Do I want to be like my parents? Do I want to be not like my parents? Do I want to do my homework? Do I want to party? If you think about even your own experience as an undergraduate or a graduate at Yale, many people here, what lifestyle do I want to live? Do I want to live what my parents expected of me and I expected of myself, or my parents are not here, I can do whatever I want. So that's a narrative adolescent event for many people. Then it went from there in narrative psychology, it went to medicine. So now there's a very popular field called, kind of a minor field, I would say, called narrative medicine, about the story we tell ourselves about illness. Then it went to narrative economics. So I would say that Shiller narrative economics, as interesting as it is relatively late in the history of narrative academic study. So by the time I found it, I had been into this for a while. So I can't say it shaped my life, but I do think he's onto something, and therefore it's an idea worth exploring. But he's a relative latecomer, if you will, to the idea of narrative and how it affects different aspects of our lives.
Thanks, Bruce. And just so everybody knows that we do have people that can translate. So if you're more comfortable asking a question in Chinese, feel free to do that, and then we can help translate.
That's awesome.
I don't know about all the other possible languages that we might have, but at least for various dialects of Chinese, I think we'll be okay. So Sa in the chat group has asked, can you share with us about how you, I guess, relieve high pressure stress and still remain concentrated, productive, and be able to still do what you do? So I guess From your own experience, what are your techniques that you do in these times of disruption?
Well, that's a super interesting question. I think that I'll say a couple things about that. I think that um, the first, I'm a big believer. Three things I'm going to say. Thing number one, name it. I got a call. This story's in my book. I got a call a few years ago. Friend, I've made some television series for public television in the United States, and I got a, and a friend of mine said, "Will you talk to a friend of mine? My friend is having this difficult time." And so I had this person called me. I think he was English, and I said, you know, tell me your story, basically. And we have this 30-minute conversation in which he tells me his story, I tell him my story. And at the end, he's like, my God, that was fantastically helpful. And I'm like, I didn't really give you any piece of advice at all. And he said, oh, no, just being able to tell my story. And then he said, my grandmother had a saying that a problem shared is a problem halved, H-A-L-V-E-D. And I love this because it turns out just telling your story to somebody is a powerfully reassuring experience. When people go to group therapy, which may be alien to the people here's experience, I've personally never done it. It turns out going to group therapy is very valuable, but it turns out the more you talk, the more it's valuable to you. And in fact, the more you talk, even if other people don't talk, or just the act of talking is very helpful. So the first thing I think that I'm a big believer is to share this story. Like, don't go through it alone. Don't suffer in silence. Find somebody. And people like different types of advice. So some people like comforters, right? I love you, Devin. You'll get through it. I believe in you. But some people like nudgers, like, I love you, Devin, but maybe you should try this, or maybe you should go to AA, or maybe you should, you know, lose a little weight, or maybe you should maybe exercise a little more. Some people, and I'm a little bit like this, like slappers. I love you, Devin, but I'm tired of hearing you say the same thing over and over again. Like, get over yourself and like get back to work, or go get out of the house, or like they really like slappers, like slap you upside the face and tell you what to do. So my first thing is like, don't go it alone. My second piece of advice is find somebody. So my first thing is just acknowledge that it's a painful experience and identify the emotion. I'm feeling stress. I'm alone. You know, wait a minute. I'm confused. I'm in my life is in Beijing and I'm living with my mother in Indiana with my children. And I don't know, just saying it. So identify the emotion, then find someone you can share that emotion with. And then I said I had a third, time shift. Okay. So I think that what the pandemic has done more than anything has broken the traditional clock for many people. The idea that work happens between this hour and this hour, and family happens between that hour and this hour. Just this idea, you're having this conversation for many of you, you know, on a Friday evening, okay? And it's whatever it is, interesting, personal growth, professional development. So the work from home, those rules don't matter anymore. There is no linear life. There's no work time and family time, okay? And so if you have your children at home with you and you need to step away from work and spend time with your children, that's okay, because you can log back onto your computer at 10 o'clock at night and answer the email. Or you can do it on Saturday morning when your children are with their grandparents or with your spouse. So what nonlinearity does is free us from the normal constructs of life that are very confining and difficult for many people. So solve the problem whenever you solve the problem. Don't worry about the time of day or what the clock says or the calendar says. And if you have to step back from your work to take care of your children for a couple of years, they're going to go back to school. And the old idea that once you step off the corporate track, you can never get back on, that's dead.
Thank you. I think those are all very helpful. And, you know, as somebody that has a foot in both East and West, I feel like acknowledging the problem and actually talking about it and sharing it is something that in East Asia is very rarely done. or done well. And in fact, I've met many people who have a resistance to this idea of like, what's the point of telling you my issues? You know, you're not going to be able to solve anything. And
well,
this
the thing about that is it's very simple. You have the issues and you have the feeling, and they are affecting your life.
Right.
You can keep them bottled up inside of you, but they're still there. So the feelings are there. And the question is, what are you going to do with those feelings? Are you going to like keep it to yourself, as you know, many of us were raised in the West End and in East Asian cultures, or are you going to try to get it out and try to handle it more responsibly?
Exactly. So I think that's always good to hear, you know, to hear it out loud. So I think that's helpful. It looks, we've got another interesting question here from somebody's phone, I guess. But the question is, how many of those suffering from life shocks succeed in their new life? You know, 50% or more. And how do they go about doing it? So, which you've already talked about a little bit, but this question
well, this to me, you know, this is, you know,
what are successful transitions? Yeah.
Yeah, I know we're coming to the end of our time here together. And, you know, to me, the big message is transitions work. Okay. Life gets us stuck. The transition is actually how we get unstuck. That is the human mechanism for getting out of a difficult situation. And the answer to your question is, one of those detailed questions I asked everyone was, how long did your life transition take? 90% of the people, 90, said that their transition came to an end. Now, for many of them, if not most of them, it was longer than they expected, and maybe even longer than they wanted, but it came to an end. And a lot of the people, the 10% who didn't come to an end, a lot of them happened to be too close to the event. And so they weren't necessarily through it at the time that I was speaking to them. So the answer is this is successful. Everything isn't perfect. There is pain involved and there's adjustment and accommodation, but that's called life. And this is the mechanism of the reason this book is called Mastering Change at Any Age is because these happen across our life. I mean, let's just take the pandemic. Okay, it's affecting everybody. Everybody on the planet is going through this in one way or another. And if you're between 39 and a half and 44, then you're having the traditional midlife crisis. Congratulations. But if you're 27, you're also having a life quake, a crisis. And if you're 67, you're having a life quake and a crisis. And if you're 15, like my daughters. So the point is, these things happen all across our life, often when we least expect that, and usually when we least want it, but it happens. And the transition is a very successful tool for getting through it. It's the only way to get through it.
Great. And let's end with this one last question, and I'm going to combine the two questions that are out there. This question of family history and how that impacts somebody's development, and then also it seems somebody's Sa's writing a memoir actually about their grandpa. So that seems like an awesome thing to do. And you've written many stories of many different kinds. So maybe you have some advice from the perspective of an author of how to go about collecting these stories and writing them down.
On the family history, I think that I'm going to pull up something while we're chatting to quickly share my screen on the way out here. The answer, what the family history does, I've talked about this family history idea a lot, and the number one question that comes up is, what happens if the children are adopted? And the answer to that question, the person who did the research actually has, I think, I can't remember the number, maybe 2 or 3 kind of biological children and an adopted child. And the point of the storytelling, it's not passed down through the blood, it's passed down through the dinner table. So in fact, he says that the stories don't even have to be true. You can make them up. But the power of it on a personality of a child, you know, I've talked about this literally in hundreds of locations. And when I talk about it, people usually nod along. Oh yeah, I'm really good at that. I talk about family history. But the truth is, that's not true. That most of us try to protect our children from the idea that life is difficult or that we have pain and we have struggles. You know, and this may be, this is not cultural, but my guess is it's even deeper embedded in the traditional East Asian cultures that we've been talking about here. I just got to heard from a 15-year-old, hello, in the chat. So the point is we want to protect our children from pain, and that's actually not serving them well. So in an age-appropriate way, it's completely fine to say, of course you're stressed during the pandemic. Everybody is, including mommy or daddy, and we're going to get through it. And here's how we're going to do it together. So in fact, if you find this, East Asian cultural, trope is to not talk about your family history, talk about your family history. It can be broken. It's not passed down through the blood. You can change it tonight with your own family. So it's, and by the way, even in this culture, even in traditional Western or sort of Western European descended Americans, there are plenty of cultures that don't want to do that. I grew up Jewish. I'm not going to talk about the Holocaust. It was too painful. It was too dark. I saw an aspect of humanity I never want to see, and I don't want you to know that that's out there. Well, it's out there. So that's maybe not doing it. What I wanted to say about life stories, can I do this? Yeah, I'm going to shrink my screen here. I'm going to remove that, and then I'm going to share my screen on the way out here. Can I do this? How successful am I going to be? Here we go. Screen one. Share. This is the homepage of my website. And if you go to that, in the middle, this part here, it says Introducing the Life Story Project, a unique way to gather family stories. If you click on that, there's actually a way that we will send you, just for a few dollars, it's, I don't know, under 50 bucks or something, we will send you a question every Monday morning that's like the one I did with my dad. So I curated the 52 best questions that I know give good answers, and we will email one to a loved one every Monday morning with the idea of write a page or two about this and you'll get another one. So I'm actually encouraging people to do it. I know you can use this or not, whatever. It's not really it's not necessary, but it's very valuable. And so keep bombarding them with questions, or send 3 questions a week and say, pick the one you want to answer. And the advice I will give from my own experience with my dad is that my dad always wanted the positive stories. And I kept saying, I want the difficulty and I want the pain. And he didn't do it. And I just kept pushing him. So start easy, like, what are the toys you played with? Tell me about your house, and work your way toward what was it like when your mother died, right? Or what was it like when you struggled with money? Or what was your experience with, racial discrimination or bigotry or sexism or whatever it be? So don't start with the hard questions, build up confidence, but don't leave the hard questions unasked.
Wow. Thank you very much, Bruce. And everyone, Devin, and everyone who has participated. This was quite a nice 1 hour plus lesson in life. And, thank you so much for waking up for this, and those of you online for staying up for this. This is really phenomenal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. We'll get through this together, and send me an email. And if you know people in the United States with interesting work stories, I'm starting that up in January. So send me any recommendations.
Wow.
Be a part of the next one. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.